Right, welcome to part one of lecture 5 for FMGT 3224. The topic of this week's lecture is activity-based costing. Now, if you think back to when we were looking at job costing, we talked about the predetermined overhead rate, and initially we looked at a plant-wide rate, and then we talked about the possibility that each department could have its own rate. In order to more appropriately allocate overhead to the production. So activity-based costing in a nutshell takes it one better. Instead of 2 or 3 rates, you can go up to 7, 8, 9, 10 as required. So in terms of the conceptual way of thinking about activity-based costing in terms of actually doing it, it's just a lot of different rates, not for separate departments, but for separate kinds of activities that take place throughout the organization. And the key, the art in doing activity-based costing, or ABC, the art in doing it well, is in figuring out which, what the discrete activities are that will drive the costs that you're trying to map and eventually allocate. So historically, plant-wide overhead rate, single rate used, and frequently direct labor was the allocation base for that, again, historically. So a couple things. Obviously, with increased automation, direct labor may not be an appropriate base to allocate overhead anymore. And it may be that there isn't any one single method. So we did look, as I said earlier off the top, at departmental rates. So a separate rate for each department. But while that's usually an improvement over a single plant-wide rate, it still isn't necessarily give you the accuracy that you want. And this is where the activity-based costing was basically born. So the general idea here is a larger number of allocation bases are used to assign cost of products, and the trick is to understand how costs behave, and can we basically measure the costs associated with their behavior and come up with rates that make sense. So some terminology here. We're going to talk about an activity cost pool, which if you want to think of it in terms of a physical metaphor, a bucket where costs associated with a particular activity are accumulated. And each of these activities has its own rate that we will establish, calculate, and use as an estimate, and that will be what we use to apply or to allocate the overhead. So, kinds of activities. Customer service. So you may say, look, all costs associated with customer service, we're going to dump into the customer service cost pool, and then we're going to look at what's the most appropriate way to allocate these costs out. It might be receiving orders, it might be complaints, it might be invoicing your customers. Each and maybe you need 3 different customer service cost pools for each of these things, and it all depends on how much accuracy you want, as to how much cost, because this obviously takes time and resources to track all this stuff, how much cost you want to incur. So potential activities in the manufacturing side, scheduling, machine setups, all kinds of different possibilities out there. Okay, so how do we go about doing this? Generally speaking, there's about 7 steps involved here. We want to kind of map the activities throughout the organization, to get a sense of what they are. From there, we need to create our activity cost pools, and so that ideally, if costs, if certain costs move together in the same way, then we can lump them together in a single cost pool, right? So a lot of this is going to be driven by cost behavior. Then we want to get a sense of what are the resources that get consumed by these cost pools, and so on. And then can we come up with an activity associated with the cost pool that we can actually measure, right? Easily, economically measure. We will then go and estimate our total volume for each activity, and then based on that estimated level of activity, estimated volume, and estimated dollars, we would compute this predetermined overhead rate, or predetermined activity rate, if you want to call it that, for each activity, and then just like we do for the other stuff, for plant-wide overhead rate and so on, allocate activity cost to the desired cost objects, the production. So as I said before, the art here is in figuring out which what are the appropriate cost pools and the activities that we will use to measure and allocate from those cost pools. So a useful way of thinking about this is in terms of a hierarchy. There are unit level activities and costs, batch level, product level, and facility level, and some activities. Unit level is every time you produce a unit, you trigger some of these costs, right? So the cost of processing the unit on the machine or by hand, consumption of whatever supplies go into the unit, and so on. And some possible measures and allocation bases for unit level costs, right? Units produced could be one of them. Could be direct labor hours, could be machine hours. Now, if we imagine we're in a manufacturing environment where the product happens for a while, and then you would stop a production run of product X and set up a production run of product Y on the same machines, and then run the production of product Y until it's done, and then move on, and then set up for Z and so on. Well, every time you set up a new batch, you will incur some costs. Maybe it's the cost associated with the order for that particular product. Usually, or often, it can be the cost of just setting up the equipment and tweaking the machines and all that sort of stuff. There are costs involved in that, but they will only be incurred when a new batch, or every time a batch is created. Could be a batch of 2 or a batch of 2 million units. Each time you set up a batch, you're going to have these extra batch level costs that are not going to vary with the size of the batch, the number of units in the batch. Then you can have, in the next sort of level of the hierarchy, product level costs. And so this is, for every product you have, you incur some costs. Doesn't matter whether you make 3 of them a year or 3 million, you're going to need to test them to make sure that the quality fits within standard. There's at the front end, there's a lot of design time and resources that get spent in creating the design for the products and so on as well. And possibly the cost of administering inventories, for example, of the raw materials that go into these different parts. And then the last hierarchy that we're going to look at is a facility level, and that's basically the factory building itself, and any indirect costs associated with it, insurance and all that sort of crap. Just with maintaining the overall facility, the factory within which all this good stuff takes place. So how does this actually look in sort of schematic form? We essentially estimate our total costs and then break them down by these hierarchy type of activities and into cost pools. So kind of step one is, as costs, as we estimate the costs, we figure out what what the costs for assembly are, machining, machine setup, and so on, and then we try to get a sense of the measures for each of these cost pools and how many of them we're going to have. And based on that, we calculate this dollars per activity measure rate, and then we actually do the cost allocation itself when we have a direct labor hour or a machine hour or a number of setups and so on. That triggers the allocation of indirect costs to the cost object, the jobs, the batches, whatever of production, using all of these different measures here, or different rates. Okay, let's do an example here. Comtech Sound makes 2 products, a Blu-ray disc player and a DVD player. For the current year, they expect to sell 50,000 Blu-rays and 200,000 DVDs. Both require the exact same amount of direct labor hours to make. Company plans to work 500,000 hours. Okay. Direct materials cost $90 per unit for the Blu-ray and $50 for the DVD player. Direct labor is $20 each. Okay. So we expect total manufacturing cost for the year to be $10 million. So if we were to use direct labor hours as the sole allocation base, we take our 10 million bucks and divide by the 500,000 direct labor hours, and we would come up with an allocation base of 20 bucks per direct labor hour. Using that, we would end up allocating exactly the same amount to the Blu-ray as well as to the DVD, and we would cost our products accordingly. Now, in addition to that information, we've got a bit more at our disposal here, because we're now going to look at what would change under an activity-based costing type system. So here's how that $10 million worth of production got kind of, accumulated or broken out. So much time for assembly, so much for machining and setups and so on. So we've gone and looked at how our costs are incurred and grouped them into these separate activities, or cost pools, if you want to call them that, or activity pools. And then we figured out, okay, what would be a good driver. So for assembly, direct labor hours. For machining, machine hours, machine setups, number of setups, and so on. So we've got the total dollars there, and now based on what our planned production is going to be, how many direct labor hours are we going to have for the DVD player, and how many for the Blu-ray, and so on. So for each of these different products, we come up with some different amounts. Okay, but really it's this total, for each of these that we're interested in, because what we're trying to do now is come up with the activity rates, and for that we're going to take the total cost of the activity, 800,000, divided by the total amount of the activity. So that 800,000, as we said here, divided by the 500,000 direct labor hours we expect, and that then gives us our activity rates for each of these activities. And then, as we go through the year with production and what have you, every time we get a direct labor hour, we're going to allocate $1.60 to that particular batch of production, and so on. And obviously, as we gain more experience with our costs, we'll refine and tweak these rates to get them, to the point where they're completely accurate. Right. So we have the option of, or the second part of this problem is going to be to allocate the overhead to the 2 products. But before we do that, we're actually going to do a demo problem, brief exercise 6-2, which is located on page 238. Take a few minutes, take a stab at it based on what you've seen in the last couple of slides, and see if you come up with the answer. And then you can watch me solve it in the part 2 of the lecture.